I'm in the green zone, and through the window there is the River Clyde, and on the other side of the river is the blue zone. So in the blue zone, the politicians and their staff and the delegates from all the countries around the world are meeting. And on this side of the river, in the green zone, we have a sort of strange mix of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and business organizations, sort of side by side, intermixed in a zone which, in theory, the public can get into as long as they've got a pass. I haven't quite worked out how you get a pass to get into the green zone, but somehow I managed to get in. I was told it's because it's not particularly busy today in the green zone that they let me in without a pass. Actually, this is my third COP, and it's interesting to compare them. So I was at the last of the major COPs in Paris when I was a member of the European Parliament, and I attended that COP as part of the EU Parliament delegation. So I had a badge for the blue zone, although I also visited the green zone. And in the Copenhagen COP some years back, which my main memory of is it was very cold. I was there when I was working for a development NGO. So it's quite interesting to have gone through sort of three ways of engaging. So COP, I was civil society in Copenhagen. COP in Paris, I was a politician in the blue zone. And now I'm private sector in the green zone again. So it's interesting to compare the three of them. And as you've probably seen on the news, there's a certain amount of derision around the organizational abilities of the Brits with this event. It is not as well organized as Paris, that's for sure. And the queues to get into the blue zone have been particularly difficult, I think, for delegates, although there was no queue to get into the green zone. And somewhat unfortunately, although there are two footbridges connecting the blue zone and the green zone across the river, they're both closed. And I've spoken to various people in the green zone. I had a chat with the people on the WWF stall, and they're somewhat cheesed off about the fact that actually this means that access for the politicians to the green zone, who they want to lobby, isn't very good. The politician will have to get on either the shuttle bus or a 30-minute walk, despite the fact it's literally just over the river because they've closed the two pedestrian bridges, presumably for security reasons. Yeah. So what appears to be happening is that Sunday, Monday, there were a lot of politicians in town, still a few around today, but the leaders, if you like, will mainly have started to leave now, leaving, which is as planned. There's not a problem with that, leaving their delegations. So each delegation has a leader, normally a senior politician, and then a bunch of staff and experts for basically 2 weeks of negotiation, which in my experience can start very early in the morning and go on late into the night. And one of the advantages of bringing everybody together in the same really quite small space for 2 weeks is it is a bit of a pressure cooker, and people get tired, and when the negotiations get a bit stuck, the fact that everyone's in the same place helps sort of move things on, in my experience. So while obviously there's a carbon footprint that goes with bringing people together from all over the world, and we know that we're still in the middle of a COVID pandemic, and the figures are high in the UK, it is important to bring people literally face to face, because that's how the best negotiations are cracked, really, is having people in the same room for hour after hour until an agreement is reached. So as a long period ahead of us, and if things do go well, we may well see the politicians, the leading politicians, returning at the end of the 2 weeks period to be part of hopefully what is a successful COP. And if things don't go according to plan, and we don't really get any major sort of steps down the road on how we implement Paris, which is ultimately what this is all about, then we may find that none of the major politicians return. So we'll have to wait and see. That was quite a major announcement around the deforestation. I think it remains to be seen whether or not that really will work. I think we all know that in the past there's been some fairly big deals done around hopefully protecting forestry, particularly in the global south, which really haven't worked out. I think the hopeful thing this time is you have the EU has signed up, China signed up, Brazil signed up. All of the big players are signed up to, I think what will be sort of formally announced today, but was trailed yesterday. So that is a good sign. From our point of view as the woodworking and sawmill industries at a European level, I mean, we've been working with European colleagues, many European colleagues, but also with colleagues from the United States, Canada, New Zealand and Australia, pretty much since Christmas, on what we've been calling a manifesto. So it was a relatively small document aimed at the politicians and the decision makers. And we launched it last week in London on Thursday at the Royal Institute of British Architects. And that is a sort of making a very simple and clear message to the politicians, which is no silver bullet when it comes to tackling climate change. Lots and lots of different things that need to be done, but they're not all of equal weight. Some things will make a bigger impact than others. And when it comes to decarbonizing the built environment, which is roughly 40% of global carbon emissions, so it's a big area to tackle, an increased use of wood in both new build and in renovation could make a significant inroad into that 40% figure. And we're talking about existing technologies, existing business models. So this isn't new technology where we have to cross our fingers and raise the money and hope it works. This is happening now. We can do it now. We just need to increase the scale of what we're doing and the speed of what we're doing. So getting that message across to the politicians is really the first foremost thing that we want to do. Is more use of wood in the built environment can help decarbonize the built environment. And in addition, that explanation about using more wood in construction, our collective feeling was that a lot of politicians realize that when it comes to 1, 2, 3-story family homes in the suburbs, in rural areas, and yes, they know we can build those out of wood. And if you look at the United States and Canada, 80% of those buildings in those areas are timber buildings. What politicians don't seem to have realized, both north and south, all around the world, or certainly not enough of them, is that we can now build at height and at scale in wood due to the emergence of engineered timbers in the last 20, 30 years. And it's now possible to build very tall wooden buildings, which is why the key picture, which is behind you, Liam, on the wall on the manifesto, is of the world's tallest wooden building, which is currently in Norway at 18 stories. And many politicians haven't yet grasped that wood can be used in city centres to build buildings as well as in rural and suburban areas. So getting that message across to the politicians was great, is primarily what we want to do here at the COP in Glasgow. I think we'll hear more and more talk in the months and years ahead about how we should try and avoid demolishing buildings at all costs. So if the building already exists, then the carbon emissions that went with its construction, they've happened, they're in the atmosphere. And the best thing we can do is work with that building as it is, rather than demolishing and starting again and creating another cycle of carbon emissions. Albeit that if we were to rebuild with wood, there might be lower emissions, there still will be emissions. And what do you do with all of the material when you've demolished the building? So yes, some can be recycled, but not necessarily all of it. We're not really geared up to recycling 1960s concrete office blocks at the moment. So the best thing to do is to renovate it, to retrofit it. And this is where wood comes in as a great material. So one of the things that we're starting to see more of, and hopefully this is where we really need to accelerate, is it's referred to as building on top. So you take an existing building, which may be over-engineered. One of the reasons it might be over-engineered is it was built, if it was an office block, to have a large number of filing cabinets in it, heavy filing cabinets. They no longer exist because we store everything in the cloud, and therefore the building can take a greater weight. So you might have a 10-story concrete office block, and you may well be able to add 4 or 5 stories in wood on top to extend the building upwards. And then you can renovate the whole building. And I think we've all now started to see pictures of before and after. And a renovated building can look like, done properly, look like a brand new building. You would have no idea that it had a 1960s concrete core within it. So there's a great place for using more wood in renovation, especially this build on top. And because wood is a lighter material, or a relatively light material, you could maybe add, say, 6 stories when you could only maybe add 1 or 2 using traditional construction materials. So the retrofitting of buildings, I think we're going to have to see and do more and more of. I saw some interesting pictures a few months ago of some 1970s blocks in the Baltics having concrete blocks having put onto the outside of them prefabricated wooden panels, which had obviously been made in a factory and then brought to site. And then, if you like, the whole building was being skimmed with these wooden panels, creating a much higher level of insulation, and also creating what essentially looked like a brand new building. In the manifesto that we've drawn up, which has the title "Growing Our Low Carbon Future: Time for Timber," we set out 5 policy asks. This was really one of the more difficult parts of drawing up the manifesto, given that there were so many people involved. There was a very long list of suggestions as to what potentially could put across to the politicians, and we really felt that it had to be a fairly short list. So we narrowed it down to 5, and of course the order in which you put them was then much debated as well. So we agreed on the 5 finally, but then we had to then go through the business of what order should we put them in. So the one we put top of the list, and I think quite rightly so, was we want politicians to, when it comes to looking at buildings, particularly new buildings, for them to consider the whole life cycle of the building from a carbon point of view. What has happened in the past is we've looked at the running of a building. So it gets built, and then we look at how much energy the building needs. If it's in the Northern Hemisphere, particularly to do with heating the building during the winter months. But increasingly, we're also now looking at cooling buildings in the summer. So how much energy is used, how much fossil fuel is therefore involved, and how much carbon emissions go with running the building. Now, obviously, that's important, but we also need to consider the carbon emissions that went with the construction of the building. And we need to add the 2 together. And that gives you, if you like, the whole life cycle of the building. And that's the true carbon footprint of the building. And one of the interesting things, particularly I think our Scandinavian colleagues have been pointing out, is at the moment, if you took a typical building, there would be the carbon emissions from building it and the carbon emissions from running it. And the carbon emissions from running it would be bigger. And as I said, we need to add the 2 together. But over time, because we're insulating our buildings better, this is going to drop. And that means in real terms, the amount of carbon emitted when the building's built is going to take on a bigger and bigger importance, if you like, as part of the overall carbon footprint of the building. So we want the politicians, when we have new bills coming up, and there's a debate as to whether it should be in law that you have to do this or whether it's just a strong recommendation. But to begin with, we would like it to be certainly a recommendation that any new bill should have its full carbon footprint set out. And that may be part of either national building regulations or local building regulations, so that the customer, the people who are going to live in the building, the client has an idea of the full carbon footprint of the building, not just the carbon footprint that goes with the running costs. So that was the one we put top of the list. The second one was just to use more wood when it comes to new build and renovation. And there's different ways you can incentivize that in different European countries. Different countries around the world are doing it in different ways, but that's important. We also had on there to look at it from a kind of bio-based circular point of view. I think a lot of politicians are picking up on the bioeconomy, and they get excited about some of the new things that we can do in the bioeconomy, say making aviation fuel from trees. That's all very exciting, but we need to sort of remind them that we can build buildings, and we can build tall buildings out of wood as well. So that was third on the list. And fourth on the list, again, and this is going to be one of those things that's going to become more and more important, is setting up systems to recycle wood so that we use more recycled wood, and that we kind of see, we see the forest as a resource. Well, we should see urban cities as a resource out of which you can draw wood for recycling. The Italians are very good at that. The Italians are sometimes places where they're making furniture which is 100% from recycled wood. So that's something that we need to do more of in future. And the last one, but by no means least on the list, was that we need to upskill our workforce with the new techniques that go with building tall buildings with wood and renovating with wood. So there's a skills agenda there, which is good for green jobs. So they were the 5 things that we settled on in the end. I can say this because I used to be a politician. We need to put across some fairly short and succinct messages, and if we can do it with pictures as well, then that's the kind of thing we need to do. And hence we've gone for a fairly colourful picture-led document, and getting that message across about building tall in wood. Clever design there is you can only see the full height of the building by folding it out. So try and convey that message about how wooden buildings can be now very tall. And this short manifesto, so one of the things we're going to do with it is in the European Parliament, where every member of the Parliament, all 700 and odd of them, have a pigeonhole. We'll put a copy of this in every pigeonhole along with a letter, as a way of trying to get this directly into the hands of all the members of the European Parliament. But if people can think of ways of doing the same at a national level, so how do we get this into the different parliaments in Canada, in the US, around the world, across Europe? So a similar kind of process. We're getting this done in a variety of languages, so people can use it in their national parliaments, but also in their regional parliaments. Often things to do with building regulations decided maybe at a regional level rather than at a national level. And if anyone can come up with any other ways, obviously it can be delivered online, but there's still a place for, especially something as nice and colourful as this, is getting it physically in a physical document form into the hands of the politicians and their staff. The staff of politicians are often just as important as the politicians themselves. They're the gatekeepers. So if you get of a member of parliament to a politician, they think it's a good idea, then they may pop that into the hands of their politician boss. An education thing. It's understandable if a politician doesn't do something if they have no idea about it. So obviously there's that educational process of informing politicians. So that's a challenge to us. That's part of what this process is all about, is getting that message across. I think part of that message is to include the fact that this is proven technology, proven business models. We simply need to upscale it and increase the speed at which we're delivering on.
Yeah.
It's not rocket science. So politicians, if we can get politicians on site, I certainly, that from my point of view, when I was a member of the European Parliament, I think that was a tipping point for me to be actually taken and shown a wooden building, a large wooden building. As it happens, it was the one in London, which is the largest wooden building in the UK, which Waffen Thistleton designed. And I think that's part of what we need to do in educating our politicians. And that, I think for politicians, if we can get across that this is already happening, is already making a significant difference, and we can help them reach that net zero target that collectively we all want to get to, then in my experience, once you've explained it to politicians, then they're convinced. Well, my home's in Newcastle upon Tyne, so actually I'm nearer to Glasgow than I am to London. So it's a day trip for me. And given the price of hotels in Glasgow, then it's cheaper to go up and down on the train than it is to stay in a hotel in Glasgow. As it happens, I'm speaking at a construction conference tomorrow in Durham, so I have to go back down tonight anyway, and then I'll be coming back up as and when needed. The next Thursday, the second week of the COP, each day has a theme, and Thursday of next week is the Built Environment Day. So that's an important day for us to be present here. But I don't have a pass for the Blue Zone, so I maybe will have to stand outside and at the gates, and as the politicians queue to get in, their 2-hour daily queue to get into the conference, that's maybe my best chance of doing some lobbying. It's quite an eclectic set of displays. So basically the private sector have relatively big stalls, which are very well staffed and very glossy. And then the NGOs have little cubicles with a poster and 2 members of staff. But it's quite a mix. So there's quite a bit around, certainly from the private sector, about new technology. And I think that's one of the sort of interesting debates in relation to tackling climate change. I don't think any of us in the wonderful world of wood would argue that there's not a place for new technology. There clearly is. But I think some of us have been slightly alarmed when we've heard senior politicians say things along the lines of 50% of future carbon emissions savings will come from new technologies which either haven't yet been invented or are not yet proven at scale. That's worrying. And on the flip side, while there's a whole lot of technology going on in the world of wood, and there are certainly things that we will be able to do with wood and wood fiber in 10, 15 years from now, which make a contribution to tackling climate change that at the moment we know nothing about. It is worrying that something as simple as using more wood in construction and renovation is seen by some politicians and some decision makers is really not very interesting. You know, it's not exciting enough for them. When you explain to people that cross-laminated timber is in effect a sort of grown-up version of plywood, then they don't want to invest a whole lot of money in it. And I think that's part of the difficulty we're dealing with, is that in this struggle that we've got to tackle climate breakdown, if wood in construction can deliver some big savings, we should do it in relation to reducing carbon emissions, irrespective of whether or not it's seen as being technologically exciting or not. So there's various things here in the green zone, which, you know, to do with hydrogen, for instance. Well, you know, no one's going to say don't do it, but I think we also need to point out that we're not there yet with hydrogen. So why not put the investment into things that we know do work, such as building more with wood and renovating more with wood. I think there's everything to play for. As I say, Thursday next week's, if you like, our big day. It's the Built Environment Day, and I think we need to make the most of this opportunity presented by the COP, both in relation to politicians who are looking for solutions and answers, and we've got plenty of those, but also that engagement with the general public. And while the general public aren't decision makers in themselves, they are key influencers on politicians, particularly in democracies. So sometimes when we complain that our politicians aren't going far enough and fast enough in tackling climate change, it can be because that they don't feel that there's public support for doing it. Now, there clearly is a head of steam amongst many electorates in many countries for their politicians to go further and faster on climate change. So therefore, I think we've also a discussion to have with the wider public about the role of wood and how it can help decarbonize the built environment, and how decarbonizing the built environment is a key step in tackling climate change overall. And I did a meeting a couple of weeks ago, talking to members of the public, not to decision makers. And however, I was very conscious of the fact that getting the public on board in supporting the use of more wood in construction and more wood in renovation, in turn can help influence the politicians. And there is a danger, and I think we're aware of it, is that there is a strand of argument around, and it flavors a little bit where we started when you mentioned the decision today about protecting global forests. It's not as simple as keeping the trees in the forest. That is not the solution to tackling climate change. Stopping deforestation is, but where trees are felled in sustainable forestry, whether it's in the north or the south, whether it's in Brazil for timber or whether it's in Germany for timber, as long as it's done in a sustainable way and replanting takes place, then that is a good way of protecting the forests. If people can make a living from the forests, whether it's in North America or Europe or Australia or in Africa or South America, if people can make a living from the forests, then they will protect the forests. And there is a strand around in the NGO world which is starting to talk about keeping the trees in the forest. And that view could infect the wider public, who in turn will say to the politicians, oh, we should keep the trees in the forest, we shouldn't use timber. And we mustn't lose that argument. I don't think we're in danger of losing it, but we have to win that argument. We need the politicians and ideally the green NGOs on the same side as us to argue that the sustainable use of timber from forests, whether in rich countries or poor countries, in the north or the south, is part of the solution to tackling climate change, but we must do it in a sustainable way.